All right, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of Riftbound 101. This is maybe my most anticipated episode I've done so far. And today we're going to be talking about the pre-Rift and limited events in general and a foundation for how to play in limited card game environments, which you can use for Riftbound, but quite frankly, you could use for pretty much anything so long as you adapt it to the parameters of the game. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is adapted from Magic and decades of people playing the game in limited environments. So, what are we going to do today? I'm going to talk about what limited means. I'm assuming that some of you already know and have played in other limited environments, but for some of you, this is going to be your first time at any sealed event ever, and there are changes to how the game is played, which we can talk about. And then what we're going to spend most of today talking about is going to be card assessment and two heuristics that I think are really useful for thinking through limited, especially for sealed, which are cabs and bread, with an added S that we can talk about. And then finally, we're going to get back to, how to apply this very quickly and broadly to your pre-rift events and sealed in general. And I'm going to be really upfront today. If you are looking for just a solid, no holds barred recommendation for which pre-rift deck you should play, I think the answer is going to be you don't know until you open it. So you're going to have to work with what you get. And I think there are going to be people who are going to be putting out tier lists that are going to tell you, like this one's better than the other one. But it doesn't matter because you have to work with what you've got. And that's kind of the premise of this video. I think there's like one single card that you can count on, which is going to be your Yone promo, and that might swing you towards a direction, but even that might not be sufficient to decide what you should be doing. So this is not going to be like an easy, one of recommendation. What I'm going to try to give you is some tools for you to approach limited, sealed, and in the future draft with. So when I say limited, and when people say limited, including the Riftbound FAQ that came out a couple days ago, we mean formats that you have to navigate with a limited pool of cards. And this generally means you're going to have to open some stuff, right? So if you are picking up the pre-rift, this is going to be your limited kit. But for some of you, you might end up doing drafts where you open packs, and that's going to be like a different kind of limited environment. And this is going to be relatively different from constructed. So one of the things that I'm going to tell you today is, to a certain extent, you should kind of take your card assessments that you've been looking at for the past month or so for Spirit Forge, and especially for constructed decks, and kind of chuck it in the trash. Not entirely, but to a certain extent for sure. So I guess the best starting point is to ask, like what is inside your pre-rift kit and what do you get to build with? Proverbially, what's in the box. So the pre-rift kit comes with a pre-made, like a sample deck of 15 cards and 5 boosters. And that means that in general, what you're going to have access to is going to be one legend and rare champion that are determined from your pre-rift kit. And there are only 6 legends that are by default, in that rotation. So Jax, Aurelia, Ezreal, Renata, Rek'Sai, and Lucian. 2 for each domain color. You're also going to get the rare champion, not the epic champion. I'm just trying to remember the rarity. And you're going to get 4 uncommons, 8 commons, and 1 battlefield, including with runes, including the runes that come in the pack. So one, de facto thing that I would mention is I'm not sure all the stores are going to have their rune bundles ready to go. So I would recommend, if you can, scrounge, like 8 or so of each rune from your pool just in case, and have that with you for comfort. And then you're going to open 70 cards total from the boosters wholesale. So you're going to get 35. Wait, no. That is a mistake. Is it? No, it's not. 35 commons minimum, 15 uncommons, and 10 rares or epics or showcases. And then you're going to have 5 foils that are going to be of unknown rarity. So they might be commons, they might be uncommons, but they might also be additional rares. So your actual like rare plus count is going to be somewhere between like 10 to 15. You can average it out at like 12 or 13, and that should give you a reasonable uh, estimation of what you're going to have in your pack. The math broke my brain for a second there. It's actually still breaking my brain. 50, 60, 65. I did the math wrong from the card boosters, unless I'm not counting the battlefields, which I think might be it. So with this, the general like rule and why I have these counts is less to give you like a math heavy breakdown of what's inside of these packs. More so, what I want to illustrate is that although you are getting a pre-constructed Rift kit inside of the like the box overall, for the most part, you're going to get a lot of gas out of your boosters. And I really want to recommend that you consider your boosters as foundational and as important as whatever hero you open. And also to consider that you may not want to play the hero that you open or the legend that you opened in favor of something else. And we should talk about some of the particularities that the pre-Rift and sealed environment presents, which I think are going to change some stuff. So sealed has different rules, which are now laid out in the rule book for how to build your deck. So in normal constructed best of 3, you get 1 legend, 1 champion unit, exactly 40 cards. The domains are those of your legend. You can have 3 copies of each card. You have a very set sideboard, and you have 3 different battlefields. And if you're in BO1, the only thing that changes, notably, is that you random your battlefields. In sealed, this is quite different. So first of all, you can decide to have a champion legend or not. And your domain identity is determined by the 2 domains of your legend plus an additional 3rd one of your choice. However, you can also choose to not run a legend and to choose 3 domains of your choice entirely. For example, you open Ezreal, you open nothing that has to do anything with Ezreal. You make a snap decision that you should actually be in like Order, Body, Fury, and all of a sudden you drop that legend and you just play other stuff. Your champion unit actually only needs to match your domain identity. It does not need to match your legend. And this is why I think Yone is somewhat of an interesting discussion point, because Yone comes with every kit. And so you're always going to have access to 1 body champion unit. And Yone is pretty decent, right? He has like a Weapon Master. There's a lot of weapons running around the set. And if he conquers an open battlefield, he can damage something in the base, in the opponent's base for free, right? So Yone, I think, fits some parameters for like what I would consider to be a good card in sealed. And I think that's factoring into some of the better assessments of Lucian as a starting champion or Jax. But doesn't have to be this, right? The other difference, deck size. So you're only going to be playing with 25 cards minimum, and my honest recommendation would be to keep it to 25 cards minimum. The larger your deck gets, the less consistently you can hit cards. The exception would have been if we had like massive discard or self-mill synergies that put stuff in the trash. Then sometimes in other games you might go above 25, but I really would not recommend doing so here. Signature spells only have to match the domains of your deck, but they do have to match them in full. So for example, if you're playing Repost and it's body order, you can't be you have to be in body and order, not one or the other in your your allotted pools. There are also no limitations on cards. So for example, you could have 5 or 6 copies of a common, and this also applies to battlefields, which you could theoretically have 3 times the same battlefield, or even 2 and 1. And also battlefields can be blank. So if you have no battlefields they want to play, you can decide to play no battlefield, and then it will just be like a blank field. And the last thing that I want to talk about very quickly is going to be that your sideboard is your entire card pool, and you are allowed to fully change the entire composition of your deck between matches. Now, I think in the interests of time and just like the general enjoyment of the event, what I would recommend is to not fully change your domain colors between rounds, but you could theoretically set up two entirely different decks that are both legal out of the same card pool and swap them in and out. What you might consider, though, is if you're having a good or a bad time and you notice certain discrepancies in your deck, just like feel free to make changes throughout the event based on whatever you open. Anything that was in your pre-rift kit is fair game as per the rules, unless my eyeballs are not working and I miss something. So what happens when you're playing sealed, I'm really going to focus on sealed today, but limited in general, is that you have to start valuing cards very differently, right? So your deck is smaller, and certain cards will also be inside of the champion zone, your chosen champion zone, which will allow you access to different frequencies of cards, different access points to certain champions that you might not be able to play in that zone otherwise. So a good example is like Akshan. If you're in body, you can just play Akshan in your chosen champion zone, and he's pretty good. He's a 4 cost for 4, which gives you a really reliable early play. He can steal equipment or other gear, and he has Weapon Master, so pretty solid. And also, battlefields like Sunken Temple that care about making units mighty. If you end up playing Fiora and somehow you open 3 Sunken Temples, all of a sudden you get to play like a pretty intensive Sunken Temple game plan that your opponent might not be able to access. Mixed in with all of this, there are no Origins or Proving Grounds cards inside of these kits. So you're going to be playing with a lot of missing fodder from previous sets. And this is going to change the way that the ecosystem looks almost entirely, right? Even if you look at constructed Spirit Forge play, there are staples in every color that are dominating the game. Cards like Challenge, cards like Defy, cards like Falling Star. These are not going to be inside of the ecosystem, and you should take that into account as much as possible when you're making card decisions. So what's going to happen, and what you're going to be doing a lot of really, is card assessment within this ecosystem. And you're going to be faced with choices where, for example, you might open a Ferris Forerunner and a Seal of Discord. And I think these are like fantastic examples of like stock cards, right? So Seal of Discord is a card that's currently like $45, $50 because it's so played in Miracle decks. And Ferris Forerunner has no price, but I expect it won't be like crazy expensive given that it is in one or both of the precons for, I think it's in the Rumble precon. Yeah, it's not in the Fiora one. And you're going to get access to it. So I open both of these. I'm a sealed player, and I would say, well, Seal is an expensive card. Surely it must be good if it's my first time. And Ferris Forerunner is relatively cheap. It's an okay card. And I think on the face of it, that would be an erroneous choice. And I'm going to talk about why like Ferris Forerunner is a card that I think is really strong. But the general aspect should be like, Seal of Discord doesn't do all that much on its own, and accelerating or reducing mana burn, or rune recycling, is not as strong in sealed as it is in constructed, where you're playing like a very cohesive strategy. Whereas Ferris Forerunner is a 6 might unit that turns into 2 3 might units. Like it's a crazy amount of value. Now, things might change if you opened Ezreal, and now you have to take into consideration, well, I can either add Seal of Discord to an already functioning Ezreal deck, or I can add a third color to play Ferris Forerunner, or I might have to switch colors entirely to play Ferris Forerunner. And then the math gets more complicated. And then the math can get even more complicated if you open a pre-rift kit for Ezreal Prodigal Explorer, but you open some amount of Lucian Purifier cards, and then you really have to start committing to one side of the plan or another. And this is sort of what happens when you go from like micro card assessments to like broader assessments. And I tend to host a lot of sealeds for friends for Magic still. And one of the things that never fails to happen is there's always some new players who will open up all their stuff. They're going to lay it out on the carpet, and they're going to panic when they see something like this in front of them, where they're going to say, I have so many cards. I have no idea where to start. This pool, which I generated with Rifty, for example, it gives me some information, but now I have like Rek'Sai and Ezreal, and I have to like figure out what colors I want to be in and what champions are accessible to me, and I don't know what to do. I don't know what color I should be. I don't know what battlefields to pick, and what do I do, right? And like panic sets in. So the purpose of the rest of this video is going to be to like give you two sort of frameworks that you can apply when you're thinking about card choices that will let you sort of trim down from this insane sheet to something more manageable and perhaps even something that is relatively limited that you will then work up from rather than down from this entire card pool at once. And the sort of guiding principle for me is Alex Nikolich's discussion about how to play sealed and how to evaluate cards. So card evaluation is easy. Understanding context is the hard part. And Alex Nikolich, for folks who might not know, is like a very high level Magic player who plays a ton of limited, goes by Corticalls, has a YouTube channel, does like a lot of this stuff. So I trust his judgment on this greatly. And I would say that like basically what he's remarking in a piece that I'll link below is that your performance, your enjoyment of a limited event, often you feel it when you're in the the match itself, the experience of play, but you are the architect of a lot of that at the level of evaluating cards and building your deck. And often you are either making your life easier or harder at that level. So the first heuristic I want to talk about is cabs. And cabs has been talked about, I think, a lot in the community, in the Magic community for the past decade, at least. Not least of which by Marshall Sutcliffe. Marshall has been a caster on the Magic Pro Tour for nigh on like a decade plus, if not more, and is one of the hosts of Limited Resources with Louis Scott Vargas now, another Magic Hall of Famer. Or Luis is not a Hall of Famer. LSV is a Hall of Famer. Marshall is a caster. But these are people who consider how to build for Limited as their full-time job. And CABS really is just an acronym for cards that affect the board state. That should really be like the main heuristic. But what that means can be radically different, right, from what you might think it does. So in a nutshell, cabs is just a baseline for cards that should go and shouldn't go in your deck. And quite quickly, those should be creatures, removal spells, and combat tricks, in that order, probably, and nothing else. So you should probably never play something like a seal in Limited, or something like Hextech Foundry, or stuff that just like generates energy or runes or is not really progressing the game in any way for you. This would be like the main cabs framework. And I think there's a really easy reason for that, right? Creatures, especially in a game like Riftbound, are really the bread and butter of how you progress the game. So you cannot score off of spells without having something on the board, unlike other card games. And so if in Magic, 99% of games are won with Limited, I would go so far as to say that in Riftbound, 100% of games are won with creatures. Like there is no way for you to win without engaging with the board in some way. Even something like Renata Glask, where you might have the Renata that scores points, it'll be virtually impossible to do so without going to a battlefield, and certainly without sticking the unit to the board. And this is the most proactive thing. Playing creatures forces your opponent to engage, and you engage with your opponent by playing creatures as well. So out of your 25 cards, you should reasonably have the majority of your deck being creatures. There's maybe like one exception to this, which would be Ezreal, where I think your preponderance of creatures might be a bit lower. But even then, you're going to need like a lot of creatures to get value and to be able to play to the board. Your number 2 category is going to be removal. And removal in Magic, we use the term spells for everything, but removal here might be creatures, gears, or spells that remove creatures or units. So, for example, Sandcrafter, I think, is a terrible constructed card. I think it's actually a decent limited card. It'll kill something a bit smaller, sometimes something that's wearing equipment, and it will like swing tempo your way. So you want removal, but you also don't want to get stuck in something like Spell Victor, because there are no legends that can just generate enough units on their own for you to win the game. The only other card that generates units is Azir, and Azir is not really playing on removal. He's doing something else, where he's transforming equipment into units. And your third category is combat tricks. So these are always risky, and you should value them less highly, largely because they require a creature on board to do anything, or a unit to do anything. So if you're thinking of stuff like Blade Dance or equipment, yes, you will have a preponderance of creatures, and that's going to be great. But you should never have, for example, like 15 equipments, 8 creatures, and a couple of removal spells, because if you don't draw your creatures, these cards are effectively dead. They do nothing. So obviously this is mitigated somewhat by having a champion unit in your chosen champion zone, but I would be careful with how many of these you include and what their preponderance is, even in decks like Lucian, where equipment gets a big boost and you can do some stuff with it. So this is like your Cabs theory should be, you should have like creatures, removal, and combat tricks. There is something that Marshall has called like his 10 commandments or his 7 commandments of Cabs that I've adapted for your use in Riftbound. So the verbiage on these is not magic, it's based out of Magic, but changed a little bit. So you're going to want to avoid cards that recycle multiple rune types. You're going to go into an event. You're going to have access to 12 runes. If you're in 3 colors, you're going to have 4 of each. If you play something that burns 2 runes, and then you have another card that needs 2 runes, there's a high chance you're not going to have the good split. So you want to avoid things that like mess with your resource space too much. And realistically, if you can get within 2 colors of runes, that would be amazing. That will make your deck more consistent than your opponent's deck. You want to balance that. You're going to want a good energy curve. So if you've watched any of the videos on this channel, I often talk about curves when I start talking about deck archetypes. This is really a call for you to think of what is an optimal energy curve inside of Riftbound. Unlike constructed Riftbound, it is going to be harder to consistently hit your 2 drops, but you're going to want them as much as possible. And then you're probably going to want cards that are 3 to 4 energy to be like the bulk of your deck, and you're not going to be wanting to play like 8 7+ drops, right? Like you do not want to have dead hands, especially in a format where fixing your hand becomes infinitely harder. You're going to want a preponderance of units pretty much no matter what deck you're playing. Like I mentioned, Lucian might have a bit more equipment, and Ezreal might have a little bit more spell count that has the multi-targeting. But for the most part, you're going to want units. And this does include spells that make units in certain cases. So something like Production Surge, if you're playing Rumble, is not, I would consider it to be a unit, but you want cards that make things that are on the board. You're going to want to avoid cards that don't have an immediate impact. So this is like your core Cabs commandment, but realistically, I would extend that to like cards that have Accelerate, for example, do have immediate impact, or cards that will play something into a battlefield are going to have like immediate impact. But sometimes you're going to have units that are just slow and that you're not going to be able to play reliably, or they're going to have like weird metrics for consistency. So I would avoid playing cards that you cannot play easily and that are just like don't have impact. To that point, 0.5, every card in your deck will have a low setup cost. So a good example of this is something like he's not legal, but like Purple Yasuo would be like a card that I would avoid at all costs because it requires so many other cards to function properly. And for this reason, I'm actually a bit lower on Aurelia going into the Spirit Forge pre-riff than I am in Constructed. You want a simple, clear game plan for scoring. The Renata Glask point cannon stuff is cool, but often it will not do what you think it does. Playing a creature that goes into a battlefield and scores, or that requires removal, is just going to be better on average. And then the last version of this, which is kind of the overarching, I think, commandment for most of Cabs, is you want to prioritize consistency rather than risky payoffs. So you want, if you can get close to 2 colors, If you can get close to a very linear game plan that does strong things reliably, that is what you want to be doing inside of sealed or inside of draft to like progress the game state as much as possible. So I'm basically telling you, play mostly creatures, play some removal, play some combat tricks, and play things that are strong and that have immediate impact on the board or that progress the game state for you. Now, again, the heuristic is really scoring points, right? It's not killing your opponent's units. It's not drawing most of your deck. It's not ramping. It is just scoring points as efficiently as possible. So cards like Sivir, like Rek'Sai Breacher, are going to be good because Accelerate is going to be not as plentiful. Cards like Drop Order are going to be good. Anything that like gets on board and has not a trash stat line and doesn't destroy your rune base is going to be good. And then the other heuristic that I think you can combine with cabs is bread. And bread is another sort of acronym that's developed over the community's, the Magic community's lifespan, and I think has sort of goes in and out of vogue depending on who you talk to and when, and more recently added the S. So some people call it bread, some people call it S bread, what have you. And bread is really intended to allow you to make some more refined choices. Because if I show you Ferris Forerunner and I show you Karina Varaza, you might tell me, well, these are both strong cards and I don't know which one I should pick for my deck. Like, what am I supposed to do here, right? Ferris Forerunner makes about 12 might. Karina makes 10 might. She has Accelerate. Ferris is more resistant to removal. Like, this one is just complicated. And so the answer is like, well, how do you figure out which one wins you more games? And I think bread or S bread as a heuristic that you add on top of cabs. So when you're done like sifting the stuff that doesn't do anything, that is like just kind of lame on board, you're going to be able to apply this heuristic to like really refine stuff that you want. So first up, you're going to want synergy. And this is where the S in S bread comes from. So cards that line up with the core orientation of your legend or chosen champion. So for example, Ezreal will like spells that double target because it'll also tack on card draw. But card draw is not that good, right? So synergy in Ezreal is strong, but it will require you to play some stuff that might not fall into the rest of the S-Bread heuristic. So this is like one of the most confusing heroes to sort of try to build for. But if you're playing something like Rek'Sai, you're going to want more units that line up with your energy curve and the cards that you have access to, and less so spell and gears, right? Because you want to be able to play those units when you go on Conquer. Or another example is like Lucian and Jax will value equipment somewhat higher than other decks because they have synergy with it. So keep synergy in mind above everything, especially if it's synergy with your legend or your champion unit, which allows you, like, you have access to reliably. Then your next thing is going to be bombs. So cards whose raw power will swing games from losses to wins. And I really want to specify from losses to wins. Sometimes you are going to be in a winning state, and playing a card that wins more is not really going to change much for you. What you are looking for are cards that you can play from losing board states or states that are at parity, which make the game impossible for your opponent to win. And then you're going to have removal, which really its purpose is that it is less good than just having a bomb yourself, but removal will sometimes let you deal with your opponent's bombs. Evasion, in games like Magic, this is creatures with flying or unblockable. Here, it's cards that let you score points with less resistance, and I'm gonna talk about that in a second to show you like two examples. And then you're gonna want aggressive cards, so cards that are assertive for the game. So as an example, one of the cards that I would like never tell anyone to ever play in a sealed environment would be something like Aurora, because it is unreliable to find it. It needs a ton of setup. It dilutes or changes the configuration of your deck otherwise, and you're going to have like trouble really relying on it. So I would tell somebody, well, if you're playing those colors, just play something that's lower to the ground, more assertive. Or if you opened a ton of bombs that are in the like 5 to 6 range, try to find a build for your deck that like prioritizes those over anything else. And then the D in S-Bread just stands for duds or dregs. So this is your filler. This is really what you put in because you're not able to make count. And sometimes, this happens to me quite often when I'm playing Magic, one of the things that can happen to you is that you're going to open a super conflicted pool and you're going to say, well, actually, like the best stuff that I have is in these two colors, but I need to put in like two cards that are kind of weak inside of the rest of the deck. And that's fine. That can happen sometimes. Okay, so let's just go through some examples. So for synergy, you're going to want cards that either increase your synergy or produce new synergy. So for example, Lucian Purifier makes all your equipment have assault. It actually gives a little bit more oomph to your deck. They're not like crazy cabs cards, although some can be, like Longsword, because Longsword is a combat trick. And if you're in third color and you open Spinning Blade, you can also play Spinning Blade and Lucian, but you want things that interact with pieces they already have. So like Lucian just wants stuff to increase the synergy that's already present in the deck. However, a card like Aurelia, a Blade Dancer legend, can actually turn targeting spells into proactive ready spells. So, for example, if you're playing big creatures and you have access to cards like Blade Dance, you have access to pump spells in green or movement spells in green. Those all of a sudden can become ready spells, which will allow you to produce like entirely new synergies and ways to play. So be careful to either take advantage of the synergies that you have or find combinations of cards that can produce new synergies, which are only available in sealed. Like a good example for this would be like Irelia theoretically could play Punch First inside of sealed, which cannot really happen in constructed. And Punch First is an amazing card. It's a really big combat trick, and it becomes ready, so it becomes like a burn 3 runes, but all of a sudden you get like +4 and pseudo accelerate on something, as an example. Then, if we're talking about bombs, you're thinking about closers or catch up, right? So, Ferris Forerunner, a card that I keep coming back to because it resembles a card from Magic called Brewmate Dragon, is an example of a card that, if you are ahead or at parity, just like locks the game out. It makes it really hard for opponents to go into a point. If they remove it actually punishes them by generating 2 units that can conquer in different locations or the same location. It's pretty complicated, right? But if the opponent's winning and you dead draw a Ferris Forerunner, it might not do anything for you. So it's a good bomb, but it's missing like a vector that it can work on. Versus something like Dunebreaker. And I think Dunebreaker in constructed is not very good. But in sealed is a card that if you are like on top decks at the end of the game and you have no cards in hand and you can play it, and then all of a sudden it draws you 2 cards, it comes in ready, so it has accelerate. Like this card's just a beating, right? And because we're in a 3-color like situation, you can probably add Dunebreaker to a lot of decks that might just need like a battering ram end game. Again, bombs and sometimes the heuristic of playing like very cheap linear cards might butt heads, but like one Dunebreaker does not make or break your curve entirely. Then we're talking about removal. So you're going to have things like unconditional removal and conditional. And the answer is going to be like play your unconditional removal as much as possible. Things like Drag Under. Theoretically, Drag Under is conditional in that it only kills out a battlefield, but I meant unconditional in that it doesn't really require other game pieces to work. You just play it. And some cases, you're going to be able to play it even cheaper if you do have synergy pieces, versus something like Strike Down, where you need a unit, a piece of equipment, and Strike Down, and all those things have to work out, and you have to play it during your turn. Like, there are so many conditions to how Strike Down needs to work, even though it is 2 energy cheaper. I find it to be like a much more restrictive spell than Drag Under, for example. So pick your removal to constrain you as the least amount possible. Then we're talking about evasion. And evasion, because there are no life points, and your primary heuristic is scoring points. I was gonna say scoring goals in Riftbound. You want to think about evasion that's offensive and defensive. And something like Bard has what I would call like offensive evasion. So the idea that if you pay an additional cost, you can move units to an open battlefield. This is like the core example of like an evasive offensive card for me is like Sneaky Deckhand, right? It can go to where your opponent has left an open space for a point, and then maybe you're going to lose that unit, but you've scored a point. Lucian's a bit different. So Lucian does still require something like an open battlefield, but the way his evasion works is that when something is open and he can go conquer there, you can retreat him back to base. And Lucian and cards like Darius Trifarian are some of the very few, I think, like I want to say like evasive defensive cards, and that they protect themselves from combat. You could also theoretically lump deflect into this, which makes them evasive towards removal. But since removal is a bit less intensive in sealed than it is in constructed, you might consider creatures to be like the primary form of interaction your opponents work. Basically, this is like just all this to say, pick cards that make it difficult for your opponents to interact with you. And then aggressive cards, right? So you're going to want some mixture of aggressive plays that are early and aggressive plays that are late. And something like Rek'Sai Breacher, I think, is super noticeable for that. Like a card that is effectively like 4 might accelerate and gives everything else accelerate. So you want to play it early. You want to run it into a battlefield. If you're on Rek'Sai as a legend as well, then you get even more benefit from that. But Azir, whose cost is only 1 higher than Rek'Sai, is actually like a late game accelerate unit. So Azir is going to turn units into base into like a battering ram, or sometimes you're going to be able to generate a Sand Soldier at the same time as you play him. So he's like 4 in asterisks. Like you can play him early, but sometimes you're going to play him late with a bunch of other units, and you're going to be able to like really run into a battlefield. And an example of this is, for example, your opponent is on 2 different battlefields, and you have like a couple Sand Soldiers. You can actually send them to a battlefield, conquer that battlefield, and then pull out Azir, accelerate him into the other battlefield, and move your units over and like double conquer. And so aggro can really be in terms of early pressure, but also in terms of like assertive turns where you can turn the tempo of the game. And these are going to be like the kinds of cards that you're really interested in when you're looking at this pre-rift, right? So you're going to want to be the assertive, aggressive player, or you're going to want to be the person who can like break that with some removal spells. Generally, that's harder. I'm just going to say that. So to go back to the question of Ferris Forerunner and Karina Veraza, there is a question which is like, what has more synergy with your stuff? So for example, Ferris Forerunner, if you're in something like Rumble, will probably have more synergy and would be stronger. But I think in a vacuum, I would prefer Karina Veraza over Ferris Forerunner in Sealed, because it will let me contest a point at any point during the game, and sometimes even to steal like a point that I had no business getting, that my opponent might either be able to hold, or if they're on like a piece of removal, you're getting recruits, so you can like dodge some removal. So it's like aggressive, it's slightly evasive, whereas Ferris Forerunner is like a bomb that is just like really hard to interact with. The final thing I want to talk about and really hammer home is that for the pre-rift and for this episode's purposes, I'm really talking about sealed and not draft. And draft is a format that I'll talk about at some point in the future when I think it becomes a bit more relevant for the game. There's some happening, but not that much. In draft, you get a lot more control over your pool, but you have to interact with other players to get access to your cards. So sealed has a couple of features, which are, you get all of your cards, and basically you only have to evaluate what you have and nothing else. But this also means that there's going to be variation. And I really want you to brace yourselves for the fact that it's possible that one player at your sealed is going to open like an insane card pool. It's going to open Lucian, Champion Lucian, the combo, and you're going to be dejected because you're going to say, well, my pool didn't look like that. And this is, I think, the main downfall of sealed, or the main downside. And there's not much you can do other than to approach the event with the idea that A, it just happens, and B, most people are not building their pools to their utmost capacity. And if you can get better at card evaluation and at building your pool, you will get more advantage than if you had just picked a slightly better pool on average, or gotten a different one. The other one is don't lock yourself in. So I think the pre-rift kit and the seeded pack is going to telegraph to a lot of people that they should be playing something like Ezreal when maybe they don't need to. And in fact, maybe you don't need to play a legend or a champion unit at all if the rest of your curve makes a lot of sense. So don't pigeonhole yourself because one or two cards seem really good at the expense of the entire rest of your deck, which is why you should choose consistency over power. You should choose a suite of 2 drops and 3 drops in red and orange over like the one copy of Last Rites and like Ezreal purple that are in purple, but then you have like nothing to go with them, right? Pick the stuff that makes your deck run smoothly rather than the stuff that makes your deck win like a crazy amount every four rounds or so. So I think a lot of people, based on this advice, might end up in a situation where they're going to be like, okay, so I have to consider my pre-rift kit versus my packs, right? Or I have to look at like what's inside my 15 card deck and what's inside my packs and what can I put into that to make it work. Or they're going to have like a pretty adversarial relationship with this. And my recommendation really is going to be like open all your cards, break apart the pre-rift kit that you got, just put them all into an open grid and look at like the frequency of stuff that you have in different colors, the strength of the bombs that you opened, and what works well together. And if nothing works well together, cut out the stuff that is like not fitting into cabs or bread heuristics and just start like whittling away all the cards that are unnecessary until you get to something that is core. And this is why like I favor this kind of approach to draft and sealed over just saying like Lucian's strong. And then if I got Lucian, I'm going to win my event. Or if I didn't get Lucian, I'm going to lose my event. Because that's not going to happen all the time. And this is to go back to Alex's point, right? Card context is always going to be difficult. You're going to have to pick cards relative to your context. And sometimes the context is going to be complicated and sometimes it's going to be easy. But I think if you like break apart, all these like pre-built arrangements of cards that the devs are giving you into something that is much more freeform and that you can start like working your way through intuitively, then you're going to become a much better limited and especially draft player if you ever play draft, where these skills I think are leveraged in a much more intensive way. But for now, sealed is fine. And I think playing sealed is a great step to approaching limited for your first time. And if you're a new player, and it's your first pre-rift and it's all super confusing to you, take all of my words with a grain of salt and play what you feel comfortable playing and then move towards something like cabs or bread once you start feeling more in control. And this is all like step one of making you a better limited player. I think there's a lot more to say about speculating on card picks and that kind of stuff, but that's for a different episode altogether. So I'm not going to burden folks with that for today. And hopefully you all have a great time at the pre-rift and you open some cool cards and you open decks that you like playing. And otherwise, I will see you next time, which will my schedule is a bit off this week because of work commitments, but probably Thursday for another In Focus episode. And I have to determine which one of the 3 remaining champions from OG and OGS I want to talk about. If you have any questions about limited or about sealed or clarifications about the rules that I got wrong, as always, feel free to write down in the comments. And if not, I will see you next time.